In this presentation, we'll consider the years of the fascist dictatorship, and we'll observe how the fascist regime will bring Italy into the Second World Conflict. So we'll observe the years of the totalitarian regime from 1925 to 1940. We'll observe Italy's military history during World War II, and we'll consider the effects of war in post-war Italy. So how the events of war are remembered and told. So if you remember, the dictatorship starts in 1925 after Mussolini's bold admission of his own moral, historical, and political responsibility in the killing of Matteotti, who denounced the irregularity of the 1924 elections. This bold move is followed by another bolder move by Mussolini, which is the approval of the so-called leggi fascistissime, the the very fascist laws, which basically abolish the freedom of the press and make it a part of the constitution or a part of a cabinet, the Great Council of Fascism, so the interior assembly of the National Fascist Party. So with the abolition of the freedom of press, the dictatorship has a much more free, we want to say, approach to the management of the government. In addition, fascism, the fascist regime at this point, so the abolition of parliamentarism, creates a new ministry, which is called Ministry of Popular Culture, or MINCULPOP, standing for Ministero della Cultura Popolare. So the ministry in charge of the propaganda, or the correct version of facts determined by the fascist regime. Now, the propaganda will be functional to the structuring of the two following terms of fascism. So after the election of 1924, there are two so-called plebiscites at the term of the 5 years of each term. So in 1929 and in 1934. So plebiscites were pretty much 99% of Italian citizens that were able to voted fascism in the form of a referendum, so as a yes to fascism. The repercussions of not voting fascism were, in most cases, losing jobs, losing privileges, losing benefits. So this was a pretty coercive propaganda and force of persuasion. Now, in the meantime, the regime retrieves its roots starting from World War I and presents itself in a military form. So Mussolini actually wears uniform, like a military uniform, as a way to structure his political power as a military hierarchy and also as a state of police in a way. So the implementation of the police against any form of dissent was also part of the dictatorship. And within this militarization of the regime, it is important to notice that the concept of militarizing life is applied not just to society but also to education. So in the creation of the young boys, the so-called balilla, dressed in uniform, and of the piccole italiane, so the feminine branch of this military approach to education, so the young Italian women. At the same time, the dictatorship wants to stage its successes. So in 1924, actually, fascism launches and releases the first highway on Earth. So the highway of the lakes, Autostrada dei Laghi, connecting Milano to Varese in the north. It's still an existing highway. It's the first highway ever built in the world. And fascism brags about the reclaiming of the so-called Agropontino. So, like an area south of Rome, there was like a swampy area and unhealthy. There was like reclaimed and regained to say civilization, especially after the foundation of the city of Latina. So fascism brags the right his own right to kind of found new modern cities. It's about it's being modern. Fascism also stages an exhibit in 1932, La Mostra della Rivoluzione Fascista, which is an exhibit celebrating the 10th anniversary of the so-called fascist revolution. So fascism saw itself as a revolution, bringing modernity and modernization to Italy. So in these exhibits, the accomplishments of fascism were staged as a way to celebrate its role, but also hide its brutality. At the same time, in 1932, fascism launches a cinematographic contest in Venice, which will be one of the, and still now is one of the most important cinematographic prizes in the world. And of course, fascism used soccer in particular through the two victories of the national team in 1934 and 1938 in the World Cup as a way to stage publicly its success. You might recall that also Hitler in 1936 would use the Olympics and the successes of the German team as a way to bolster the successes and the consensus of his regime. So it's kind of the same dynamic, the idea of fascism or totalitarianisms using sport as a way to stage their successes. Now, during this time, the Italian industry develops, so in the 1920s and above all in the 1930s, and develops around the model of autarky, so of self-reliance, reconverting like industry from an interconnected international production to a production that is given for kind of the national market through national materials for the national market. So this is an industry that is heavily state-controlled. The state actually subsidizes a lot of the most important companies, so the car makers Lancia and Fiat, but also the typewriter company Olivetti or SNIA, which was producing rayon for the uniforms of fascist hierarchs. At the same time, after the financial crisis of 1929 that in America that had like a lot of repercussions in Europe, in front of the financial struggle to support businesses, fascism created a kind of the Italian equivalent of Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac, which is called the IRI, Istituto Ricostruzione Industriale, so the Institute for the Industrial Reconstruction, financing struggling businesses. This was related to the fact that fascism promoted itself and promoted the industrialization of Italy as a piece of modernization. The regime always saw itself as the peak, the apex of modernization, rather than a conservative movement. And in fact, fascism adopted methods of production that were related to American Taylorism, and the assembly lines and the division of labor was actually introduced in the 1930s in Italy. And at the same time, Mussolini and the industry under fascism was an industry that bet heavily on kind of graphic modernization. So the idea of design as a way to modernize products. Design is really flourishing during the fascist era because of one reason, paradoxically. So fascism as a nationalist movement needed to create Italian products. So to move away from imported products and give a clear notion of what an Italian product must look like. So this had an impact on design and fashion because it forced Italian designers and fashion designers to really identify the characteristics of what makes an object or a product or a clothes Italian. So this will be developed later in the years of the industrial boom after World War II. Now, design was also related to the model of autarky, so the self-reliance on materials that were not imported. So fascism actually exalted the metal of aluminum, which was like a cheap metal and a metal that didn't require importing more elaborate raw materials. So autarky forced the creativity of designers to invent with the little they had. So in this sense, the 1933 Mocha, so the coffee maker by Alfonso Bialetti, was a way to turn a poor metal like aluminum into a creative piece that still nowadays is incredibly popular and iconic. Also, design was related to graphic design, as we were saying, through, for example, the work of Gino Boccasile, the designer of the style, the so-called Ventennio style. Ventennio is the word in Italian that means 20 years, that is often used to identify the 20 years of the fascist dictatorship. So the Ventennio style was really a very masculine, edgy, and strong design that matched the characteristics of the regime, its muscularity, its force, its power, its military stand. At the same time, as we were saying, fashion develops, and Mussolini in 1936 wants to open an agency for kind of the Italianization of fashion. Fashion was heavily French until that point, and this nationalist stand actually paradoxically led to the development of a reflection on what an Italian style in fashion could be. Now, fashion was also, like design, a much freer space than the intellectual space of philosophy, journalism, press, academia, which were heavily under control. Fashion and design were considered like less important by fascism, and in this sense we see, for example, the development of the so-called signorina grandi firme, so the big signature, big brand young lady, who became, especially in the late 1930s, kind of an image of a much more emancipated woman than the one that was portrayed by the propaganda, so a woman that should be a mother and produce children for the homeland. Now, these images give us a sense of not just like an emancipated womanhood, but also of fashion as a much less censored reality. It would be the same for feminine literature of the 1920s and 30s, which was considered like an inferior literature, but this gave us the paradox of having now a corpus of works that are giving us the sense of an uncensored reality. So they were not censored. So they were paradoxically freer spaces. Also, Mussolini invested a lot in the idea of like turning the fascist regime into the apex of modernity through the celebration of aviation. In particular, in the figure of Italo Balbo, who was like an aviator that flew across the Atlantic from Rome to Chicago in 1931. There's still a monument in Chicago dedicated to Italo Balbo and celebrating this feat. So at the same time, fascism intended to stage industrialization as something extremely modern and sort of like in acceleration, following the race, the competition of modernity, as we see in the factory of Fiat in Turin, designed by Giovanni Mattei Trucco and called Il Lingotto, that features basically a racetrack on the rooftop of the factory, of the production plant. At the same time, fascism insisted a lot on connecting this process of modernization, industrial modernization, to culture, especially through the myth of Rome, as a way to ground this modernization and also to connect the regime to the first Rome of the ancient Romans, the second glory of Rome during Baroque times, and the third Rome staged by Mussolini. This will lead to the intrinsic push to create another modern Roman Empire, similar to the ancient Roman Empire. We'll talk about it in a few minutes. But culture was also related to certain figures, like the figure of Senatore Borletti, who in his life stages really a case study of the ramification of industry, culture, politics, and their intrinsic and complex relation. So Borletti was the owner of linificio, so it was produced in linen since the 1860s. In 1896, he actually founded the first Italian company of clockmaking. They were producing like alarm clocks, so as a way to challenge the German and Swiss dominion in the market. Basically, during World War I, he started to reconvert his production from watches to bomb fuses, and he actually made a fortune, which he reinvested in 1917 in the creation in Milan of a very famous department store, La Rinascente, and the name La Rinascente will be given by the Italian poet Gabriele D'Annunzio. And Gabriele D'Annunzio will be the poet that will launch the experiment of the Fiume Republic, which will be actually supported financially by Borletti himself. So D'Annunzio really became a close affiliate to the industrial story of Borletti. Now, Borletti has to do with watchmaking, with textile and fashion, and with politics and culture. But his influence is not limited to just the 1920s or the 1930s, but goes beyond the war. And this is the case of many Italian companies which started during fascism and then developed during the war and after the war. So the alarm clocks Veglia were reconverted, and the name Veglia was also a brand produced by D'Annunzio. They were reconverted in the post-war years in the Veglia speedometers for cars. As for textiles, La Rinascente became one of the most important department stores and brands still nowadays, one of them across Italy and the world. But at the same time, Borletti became the owner of Snia Viscosa, which was a company investing in rayon and in the production of fascist uniforms. So this was like an immense commission for Borletti. This insistence in textiles and fashion will go on after the war with the reconversion of production from uniforms into sewing machines. Borletti became pretty important in the production of sewing machines. With politics, well, after the financing of the Fiume experiment, Borletti started to support openly fascism by acquiring Il Popolo d'Italia, one of the newspapers that will be more aligned to fascism. It will be kind of the voice of the regime, as opposed to Il Corriere della Sera, which opened in entering in an open contrast with the regime. At the same time, the collaboration with D'Annunzio continued, and actually Borletti managed to acquire the rights of D'Annunzio's works. D'Annunzio was like the most important Italian poet at the time, and was famous throughout Europe and the world. So basically, Borletti entrusts the works of D'Annunzio to a young and relatively unknown typographer from Verona, Arnaldo Mondadori. And that will be the start of Mondadori, the publishing house that is now one, if not the leading publisher in Italy still nowadays. So you see the intersection of several industries with politics, culture, and business. And in the case of Senatore Borletti, it is very evident how fascism plays through certain collaborations and network of people across various fields. So it's an all-pervasive totalitarianism. So it's about the totality of reality. Now, at the same time, fascism manages to produce through Fiat some of the most the first really popular cars. The most popular car of the 1930s is the Fiat Balilla of 1932. And this will be an immensely popular car. And we see here like another poster by Marcello Dudovic, one of the most important illustrators of the first half of the 20th century, once again depicting a very emancipated image of a woman, well-dressed, empowered, and actually going to drive the car, which was unthinkable, if you want. So once again, design and fashion are like uncensored realities that allow us like a deeper understanding or a different understanding of fascism. The other model of car that was really popular was the Fiat Topolino or Cinquecento of 1936. And here is another ad by another great illustrator, Giuseppe Ricovaldi del Bava, portraying the production of cars as a way to democratize mobility and transportation. So once again, the connection between regime industrialization and modernity. At the same time, Mussolini wants to reconstruct the new modern space of Italy, so architecture becomes key in the dictatorship. And there are two movements, one is rationalism and the other Novecento, that are basically trying to organize this or give a face to this modern regime. So rationalism was more focused on kind of the geometry, the geometry of space, the control, the rational control of space. So we have like architects like Adalberto Libera, who will plan the Palazzo dei Congressi in the Eur neighborhood of Rome. That Eur neighborhood was designed in the late 1930s. It was supposed to be the new modern neighborhood of the city, destined to the Esposizione Universale Roma, so the World's Fair that was supposed to take place in Rome in 1942. It will never be completed. It will be completed after the war in recognition of the architectural value of the site. Adalberto Libera will be also the architect of the house, the Malaparte house in Capri. So the idea of like rationalizing even the asperity of nature and the terrain. Giuseppe Terragni is the master of Italian rationalism. This is like his masterpiece in Como. Is the Casa del Fascio, and once again in Como, his hometown, was the site of like his works that kind of apply a geometrical notion of repetition to the kind of control of space that the regime was setting in place. Giovanni Muzio was part of the Novecento movement, which had like more of a classical resurgence. So the idea of following Roman architecture and kind of turning it into a modern key as a way to stage the face of the new Roman Empire wanted by fascism. So Muzio is the author of the so-called Ugly House in Via Moscova in Milano. And also he worked on the planning of the dome of the Basilica of the Nativity in the city of Nazareth in the Holy Land. And lastly, Marcello Piacentini, who really became the architect of the regime. He worked on the University of Rome, La Sapienza. He worked on, we see the Tribunal of Milan, so the massiveness of columns, the staging of a massive power. But Marcello Piacentini is also the architect of Via della Conciliazione, so the street that connects St. Peter's Square to the Tiber River, so connects the two sides of the Tiber in Rome. So the one side, the religious side, to the secular side of the city. And actually, Via della Conciliazione was a physical representation of the conciliation that Mussolini signed with the Catholic Church, with the Lateran Pacts in 1929, that end the so-called Questione Romana, so the issue of the two kings in Rome, so the presence of the Pope and the King at the same time, and also the denunciation of the Pope to be prisoner in Vatican by the Italian state. And the Lateran Pacts actually created the formation, what we call now the city-state of the Vatican City, which is kind of a square-mile city, which, however, allows the Pope to have a territory and also to have a diplomacy. So the Holy See is present also now at the United Nations by virtue of having a territory. So by virtue of this small territory granted by fascism to the Church can become like a universal partner in global negotiation and affairs. In the 1930s, after the 1929 financial crisis, also fascism knows some struggle industrially, as we saw with the creation of the IRI, but also politically. And one of the ways to get out of this struggle was really to try to bring the crisis from the inside to the outside. So that is one of the reasons why in 1935, actually, Mussolini launches a campaign in Ethiopia, also as a way to vindicate the colonial defeat of 1896 in Adwa that was seen after 40 years as a shame for the Italian state and as a testament to the unaccomplished Risorgimento of the nation. So he announces this campaign, and in 1936 he actually manages to conquer the Ethiopian territory, mainly by uses of gases in violation of the rules preventing states from using chemical weapons. There were rules that were ratified after World War I. So in reaction to Mussolini's use of gases, Italy is placed under embargo, an economic embargo. So until this point, England, France, and the United States, FDR, were actually quite favorable to fascism as an anti-communist regime. So it was a good antidote against the formation of a Soviet state similar to the USSR. But the episode of Ethiopia really forced the embargo on Italy and forced the regime to implement the discourse on autarky, so on self-reliance, as a way to offer a counterpart to this embargo to the citizens. At the same time, Italy remains without any other partners to be allied with. And this is one of the reasons why in 1936 Mussolini looks for the alliance with Hitler, the Steel Pact. So in 1936, Mussolini finds a partner in Hitler. This partnership will lead Italy into the grave responsibility in 1938 of signing laws for the defense of race, so anti-Judaic laws, anti-Semitic laws, and to Italy's participation in the Holocaust, which really starts in 1938 with the approval of these laws. Now, Hitler also gets Mussolini involved in his plan of expansion from 1933 to 1944 and the conquest of Austria, then parts of Slovakia, and then going back to 1939 on September 1st, when Hitler, who had been tolerated until then, launches his attack to the Polish city of Danzig, connecting the two parts of the German control, like the mainland, to the Pomeranian. So Hitler enters this war, which was supposed to be like a revenge for World War I, and also kind of a blitzkrieg, so a flash war. And in this war, however, Italy remains neutral in the beginning. However, in 1940, by 1940, the spring of 1940, Hitler pretty much gains the control of all of Europe. He marches into Paris, conquering the city, and starts like a satellite republic in Vichy in France. And by virtue of this dominance of Hitler, really Mussolini decides in the spring, on June 10th, 1940, to really join the war. And the announcement is really staged as a celebration of Italy's future victory, guaranteed by what Mussolini called like really a bunch of casualties that could allow Italy to sit at the table of the afterward, the treaties. Italy, however, was not prepared to the war. Actually, the weapons that Italy had by 1940, and this was the reason why Mussolini was hesitant in joining the war right away, were still the weapons of the Libyan War of 1911 and 1122, especially the rifles, the Wetterly rifles. So this was like an issue of military unpreparedness. However, the dominance of Hitler led Mussolini to think that the war would be short. Now, Italy, in the first few years of Second World War, is allied with Germany and is fighting over three fronts. One is the Greek front. So basically, Italy tries to connect its possessions in the Aegean, so the Dodecanesian island, the most important one was Rhodes, to its protectorate in Albania. So attacking Greece was a way to expand Italy's dominion in the eastern Mediterranean. The Greek campaign, however, is stuck in the Balkans and also blocked by the Greek resistance. So this forced Germany to really send troops in the Balkans to help the Italian ally. The second war front was in Africa. So Italy had a colony in Libya and wanted to expand its dominion in Africa by going east toward Egypt and connecting Libya eventually to Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia. So the possessions that Italy acquired from the Ethiopian campaign. Also here, Italy encountered difficulties in fighting against the Anglo-Saxon, the Allies, and Rommel, the German general, was sent to help out with this Africa Corps. And the third front was Russia. So Italy was involved in the Russian campaign that Hitler launched against the Soviet Union and sent its troops, actually its most valuable troops, the Alpine Corps. Now, this is Italy, Europe in 1942, so the dominion of Hitler is pretty evident. But 1942 is also a key turning point in the war, especially in two military contexts. One is Stalingrad, and Stalingrad is the site of the siege, prolonged siege of the Soviet city, and the other is El Alamein, the Battle of El Alamein in northern Africa. Now, Stalingrad was marking the defeat of Hitler, who went in the Russian territory, expanding until winter came and the Russians attacked. This forced Germans and the Italian corps of the Alpine to withdraw. And this episode of the withdrawal of the Alpine Corps and the death of many of them was really a sort of mythical chapter of the Italian war. This will remain in the collective memory also up to this point. So a loss that becomes a testament to the heroism of the Italian soldiers. The same will happen in El Alamein, where the Italian troops and the German troops in the desert are attacked by the Allied forces and are forced to withdraw. so the victory in El Alamein, where all the Italian fascist army are killed, so giving witness to their heroism, basically leaves room for the advancement of the Allied forces to Tunisia, and leading the way in 1943 to actually plan a landing in Italian territory in Sicily. The landing was by Canadian, British, and American forces. And in particular, the American forces are related to a story of negotiation of a Sicilian American, the so-called Lucky Luciano, who was a criminal in the American mob that actually was promised liberation, release from jail, in exchange of military information or a contact with the Sicilian local mafia as a way to ease the American landing into Sicily. So this is why the landing in Sicily was actually way easier than the most famous kind of landing in Normandy in the D-Day. After the landing in Sicily, or in contemporary, American forces and the Allied forces invade Italy through other means, so in Anzio and near Naples. And this, a few days later, so 2 weeks later, will lead to actually the fall of Mussolini, who will resign to the king because of the invasion on the national territory of an occupation force. So the enemy invaded Italy. And Mussolini basically establishes the end of fascism, or the Great Council of Fascism. And the new head of the government becomes Badoglio, who is the general of the Italian army. So in the 40 days, we'll talk about the 40 days between July 25th and September 3, but on September 3rd, Badoglio signs an armistice with the Allies. The armistice is actually communicated, and this was one of the conditions, almost a week later, on September 8th. And this is the date that all Italians remember, September 8th, as the end of the war against the Allied forces, and in many cases, and this was one of the key misunderstandings, the end of the war itself. So this is the official communication.
Il governo italiano, riconosciuta la impossibilità di continuare la impari lotta contro la soverchiante potenza avversaria, nell'intento di risparmiare ulteriori e più gravi sciagure alla nazione, ha chiesto un armistizio al generale Eisenhower, comandante in capo delle forze alleate anglo-americane. La richiesta è stata accolta. Conseguentemente, ogni atto di ostilità contro le forze anglo-americane deve cessare da parte delle forze italiane in ogni luogo. Esse però reagiranno ad eventuali attacchi da qualsiasi altra provenienza.
So the head of the Italian government and the head of the Italian army is announcing that Italy is no longer in war against this previous enemy, so the Allied forces, but is actually not saying whether the war is over or not. And this will lead to a period of confusion. Many of the soldiers thought the war was over, whereas the war was far from over. In fact, the war was on the one hand, the so-called Italian campaign of the Anglo-American forces that really invade Italy, liberating Italy from the German invader, who in the meantime, in the 40 days between July 25th and September 8th, had invaded Italy militarily and was heavily present in the peninsula. So this American campaign, or Allied campaign, will end in 1943 at the so-called Gustav Line, right south of Rome. 1944, it will arrive at the Gothic Line, and it will end on April 25th with the liberation of Milan, which is considered the end of war. Now, in parallel with this war, the larger war between the Allied and Hitler, there's also the war of the Italian resistance against the German military occupation. So a lot of Italians, especially in the center and in the northern part of the peninsula, were fighting against a very fierce military occupation by the Germans. Actually, the Germans retaliated pretty heavily against the former ally through massacres and slaughters that became really well known and really cruel symbols of the German retaliation. I mentioned 3 of them. There are many more. The most famous one is the Fosse Ardeatine, so the killing of like 355 Italians near Rome. Sant'Anna di Stazzema, that became also the subject of Miracolo at Sant'Anna by Spike Lee, and the massacre of Marzabotto near Bologna along the Gothic line. So the military resistance against the German occupation was run by mostly the communist partisans that really wanted to legitimize the Communist Party as a future party of government. So the War of Liberation was legitimizing them as a serious party for the aftermath of war. And at the same time, Catholic and liberal partisans, moved by 20 years of anti-fascism, like the communist partisans, were leading the charge against the Germans, but also against the Italian fascists that didn't want to betray their allegiance to the regime. So this liberation war actually becomes or has the form of a civil war opposing Italian former fascists that were faithful to their previous alliance with the Germans to anti-fascists who were fighting the regime during the Ventennio, but also found support in the Allied Italian campaign. In the meantime, Mussolini, who resigned and who was captured and imprisoned near the Gran Sasso in the region of Abruzzi, was actually freed by Hitler and forced by Hitler to found a new fascist republic in northern Italy, the so-called Repubblica Sociale di Salò, so the Social Republic of Salò in the midpoint in northern Italy. As the Allies enter Milan on April 25, 1945, Mussolini tries to escape from the city of Milan to Switzerland. But along his way, he's captured on the border by a partisan group and killed 2 days after, so on April 27th. He's killed without a trial. This will be a key moment in not really negotiating the trauma of fascism and prolonging its kind of negotiation up to now. So there's no Nuremberg process, Nuremberg trial in Italy. And this is because of a trial that was not done on Mussolini. So Mussolini was killed and his body is hung in one of the piazzas of the city of Milano, Piazza Loreto, along with his companions and his mistress, Claretta Petacci. Now, this is the cover of El Popolo, so l'Italia è libera, l'Italia risorgerà. So the end of the war is marked by the idea of Italy is free and Italy will rise. So once again, the idea of the risorgimento, the new kind of coming back to life of the nation. Before talking about what happens after the war, we need to really see how these events, the trauma of these events, is portrayed. How did the memory of this event took form, and this is kind of the famous scene of Roma Città Aperta, Rome Open City, identifying once again the image of an Italy violated, kind of raped by and killed, like Pina, the protagonist, interpreted by Anna Bagnani, by the German invader. Now, there is a literature of the resistance that aims at celebrating the resistance as a moment of resurgence, of national resurgence. And 2 are the masterpieces of it. One is Il Sentiero dei Nidi di Ragno by Calvino, so the path of the spider's nest, telling the story of the resistance as seen through the eyes of a kid. So as a way to tell the trauma without addressing it directly, but through the eyes of a kid. And the second masterpiece of Italian resistance in literature is Beppe Fenoglio's Una questione privata, so a private affair, reducing the war to a private affair between two soldiers, and especially one of them who is looking for the other in order to know if the other loved the woman he loved. So kind of like a love triangle, but really reducing the global stage of World War II to a private affair between Italian anti-fascists and fascists in a way. Also, in the years after the war, the memory of the Holocaust and Italy's participation in the Holocaust starts to emerge, especially in correspondence with the publication of Se questo è un uomo, If This Is a Man by Primo Levi, one of the masterpieces of the Holocaust literature. A literature that brought the light to Italy's participation, active participation in the Holocaust that has always been kind of diminished. Italy was complicit, accomplice of Germany in this. And in particular, cinema assumed a new role in giving visual memory to this new nation, especially through the movement of neorealism. Neorealism is a cinematographic school that really focuses on reality as an antidote to 20 years of fascist propaganda. So reality as something staged through a non-mediated context. So the set is reality. The set of Rome Open City is the actual Rome of 1944 in the days of its liberation, June 4th, 1944. Reality is staged through a non-mediated language, so dialect spoken by often non-professional actors or actresses. So also camera has a documentary function. Camera participate to the action, kind of not intervening, not mediating the action, but giving us a real assessment of the situation. So the three big masters of neorealism are Roberto Rossellini, Vittorio De Sica, and Luchino Visconti, and the most important works that you might know, the movies, are Ladri di biciclette, Bicycle Thieves by Vittorio De Sica, staging the importance of bicycles in really going to work and staging the poverty of a nation after World War II, completely destroyed and on the verge of collapse, but the attempt to reconstruct a new social fabric for kind of life. Then Roberto Rossellini's Roma Città Aperta, Rome Open City, which is staged in Rome during the time of the German occupation and really staging the martyrdom of Italy under German invasion is represented in the cinematographic version of the Pietà by Michelangelo. So in the figure of Father Pietro, interpreted by Aldo Fabrizi, holding the dead body of Pina, who was running to save and call his beloved Francesco, who was captured by the Nazi. At the end, Father Pietro will be killed by the Germans, offering himself as a sacrifice. And the movie closes with the image of children looking at this terrible execution. And the children, as in Calvino, are functional to really staging the memory of the events for the future generations. So these kids of the movie will tell this story, will conserve the memory of this story for future generations. And Rossellini also stages in Paesa the story of the Anglo-American campaign of Italy, and in particular this movie, which is set in 6 episodes along the path from south to north of the Allied forces. In this movie there is a scene that is particularly moving, especially in the episode of Naples, where we see like an African-American soldier in the ruins of Naples that interacts with an orphan. And they don't talk the same language. They don't understand each other through words. But at a certain point, he understands, he tells the story to the kid of his imaginary return to America, glorious return to America. But at a certain point, he stops thinking, well, in America there is segregation. So the experience of freedom that African American live in Italy, especially in the relationship with the Italian women, is something that will not come back at his return to America. So he mourns his condition until the point in which he realizes that the kid is an orphan, and in the language of their common pain, in their common loss of freedom, they find a common dialogue and a form of communication. So Rossellini wants to stage the language of sorrow as the language which allows people to understand the drama of what happened and face the trauma, face the memory of this event as a human story, as a realistic event.